All right, everybody, let's go ahead and get started. So thanks for joining us today. My name is Kevin Hancock, Director of Solutions at ExoStar. And during today's webinar, we're going to talk about CMMC for SMBs or small and medium-sized businesses and some affordable compliance strategies. I'm very happy today to be joined by one of ExoStar's partners, Bridget Wilson of Network Coverage. Bridget, you want to take a minute and introduce yourself and Network Coverage?
Absolutely. Thanks very much, Kevin. I'm Bridget Wilson. As you said, I am the Senior Vice President of Governance, Risk, and Compliance at Network Coverage. We are a managed services provider, managed security services provider, and CMMC RPO, which is a mouthful. We came about as an MSP and IT provider. That's been our bread and butter since 1996. We've supported large commercial contractors, manufacturers, small, medium-sized businesses in the engineering space. And really SMB is sort of our niche. And we've been supporting companies of a smaller size through their implementation of 800-171 since way back, call it 2017 or so when the controls first came about. So very happy to be here. Thanks again, Kevin and ExoStar, for having me. It's going to be a good discussion. Looking forward to it.
As am I, Bridget. Thanks so much. So as we get started today, whoops, let me see if I can advance my slides. So before we get started, just a few housekeeping details. So today's session scheduled lasts 45 minutes to an hour. That does include a question and answer. You will be muted during today's presentation so we can talk without interruption. The questions we're going to be answering were those ones that were submitted by the audience when you registered for today's session. If for some reason we do have an outage during today's webinar, you can just go ahead and try and refresh your page. If that doesn't work, you can utilize the link that you were sent via email to come back into the session. Now, this hasn't happened yet, but just in case. So this webinar is being recorded, and it'll be available on demand via the ExoStar's resource library anytime after today's event. Now, before you ask if you're going to get the slides and if you're going to get the recording, you'll also get that if you've registered for today's event. And obviously, if you're here, you have. You'll also receive that as a follow-up email from ExoStar. If at any time you'd like to speak with one of our industry experts, if for some reason you lose the slide deck and you want to get another copy, you can reach out to us at cmmc-team@exostar.com. You can also reach us on our website, www.exostar.com. There's a live chat feature there on every page, and we'd be more than happy to engage with you via that channel as well. So this is the agenda Bridget and I are going to cover today. I've just finished the introductions. I'm going to give a short CMMC ruling update, kind of where we are in the overall program of CMMC and where we are in kind of that implementation timeline. I'll then turn it over to Bridget for her section. And then we'll come back out and do the question and answer. I also do, as we go into the question and answer session, have a poll that I'll put out there for you. And I'd appreciate your feedback in that poll as well. So first, kind of where are we in the rulemaking process? So CMMCs was placed in the Federal Registry in December 26th of 2023. Right, so we got a Christmas present from the Department of Defense, and that kicked off a 60-day public comment period. That period closed on February 26th of 2024. There were thousands of comments that came in from all over the US. And now the DoD is going through, answering those comments, providing additional feedback, updating the rule, etc. And that's kind of where we are currently in the process. Now, if you read the rule as it was published, there weren't really a whole lot of surprises in there. But, kind of the biggest takeaways is, one of the major reasons for CMMC is that people feel very strongly that we need to move away from a self-attestation model, which we have today with the federal with the DFARS clauses that are currently in contracts. So we've moved away from that, and we've moved to a model where once every 3 years, you'll need to provide a third-party assessment of your compliance with the NIST 800-171 controls. You'll still need to do a yearly affirmation that you do those things, but this third-party assessment is really kind of that key differentiator of the CMMC program. There was also some additional clarification on whether or not POAMs, and a POAM is a plan of action and milestone. So if you don't have one of the NIST 800-171 controls implemented for your organization, you should have a plan of action and milestone to address that control. When you do that, you've got 180 days to close that POAM. There are some other additional rules around it, like you can't. There are certain controls for which you can't have a POAM, and there are quite a few of those. So it behooves you before you go for a CMMC assessment to do a true self-assessment, understand kind of where you are, and make sure you got these controls in place. Now, kind of just a recap of CMMC itself. We've moved to a model of 3 different levels. One of those are for those of you who do not work with controlled unclassified information. The only thing you have is FCI, federal contract information. That's a level 1. So if, this is the majority of the defense industrial base. So 63% of the defense industrial base will be allowed to do a level 1, or say that they're level 1 and do that self-assessment against those 15 requirements. You'll still have to do this annually. You'll have to provide an affirmation about that. Level 2 is where these certified third-party assessments come into play. And then level 3 are for those of you who will do high controlled unclassified information. And you'll have to do more than just the 110 controls of 800-171. There are some additional controls around that, which you'll also have to meet. And that third-party assessment will actually be done by DIBCAC once every 3 years. They also qualified some terms out there. One of those is an external service provider. These are folks like Network Coverage who provide MSP services. And as you utilize those companies to assist you in your overall compliance needs, you're going to have to verify that those MSPs are at the same level of CMMC that you yourself are trying to achieve. So if you're trying to achieve level 2, then your MSP should also be at level 2, etc. They also defined what a cloud service provider is and the requirements for those. So cloud services are going to be those, just that, right? Those SaaS applications, those SaaS vendors, etc., that provide you a place to store, process, or transmit controlled unclassified information. Those services will have to come from a provider who is either FedRAMP moderate or FedRAMP moderate equivalent. And then they also publish some rules around what body of evidence those cloud service providers need to provide to you as a consumer of those services. So just some things to keep in mind as you think about your implementation. Now, when CMMC takes effect, and it's expected to take effect in early 2025, there is also going to be an implementation period. It's a 30-month period until full implementation, and the phases, are broken out here. That phase 1 for about 6 months, once it takes effect, you'll still be at kind of that self-assessment model, right? It's a chance for the rule to be in effect. It's a chance for the if you will, the CMMC ecosystem itself, those C3PAOs, to come up to speed, to start doing assessments, to ensure that we have enough registered practitioner organizations, those RPOs, those C3PAOs, et cetera. After that first 6 months, you'll start to see the requirements for CMMC Level 2 certifications start to appear in new contracts. And you won't be able to bid on those contracts if they have those clauses without that third-party assessment being completed. Phase 3, you'll start to see Level 3. You'll start to see Level 2 appear in continuing contracts and option periods of contracts. And then phase 4 is when you'll start to see full implementation. So just some time frames to keep in mind as we move to this. But even with a start date in 2025, you really should be doing these things already today. You've signed contracts, if you're in the defense industrial base, that have flow down requirements or that have these clauses in them, 7012, 7019, 7020, etc. These require you today, if you receive controlled unclassified information, to secure it following the NIST 800-171 standard. Additionally, if you've got 7019 clause in your contract, you're required to do a self-assessment and score yourself against those 110 controls, and then update the supplier performance risk system with that score that you did as part of your self-assessment. And that score is going to range somewhere from a -203 to 110. And the reason you have that kind of split is because when you start to do your self-assessment using the 800-171 alpha, the assessment guide, some controls are worth 5 points, some controls are worth 3 points, and some controls are worth 1 point. And you'll deduct it if you don't have that control in place from that 110. And so that's how you generate that SPRS score. So, if you are questioning, right, we've been hearing about CMMC for quite a while, and maybe you or your boss or somebody in your organization saying, look, we've been talking about this for years now. It's not really ever going to take to effect. I got to say, I would disagree with them. The latest news we have from the Department of Defense is that we are moving forward with CMMC 2. The timeline continues to keep going forward, if you will, and they keep hitting those marks that they say they would on paperwork and implementation and comments and feedback, etc. So it really is kind of across the community expected that we will see this in early 2025. So with that, I'm going to bring Bridget onto the stage and let her talk about the topic today around affordable compliance strategies.
Yeah, thank you so much, Kevin. Again, I got to tell you that I am having conversations day in and day out. Where are we at? Is CMMC happening? Is it real? And yes, it absolutely is. We know it is. So thank you very much for the updates on timeline. Of course, we're as a provider and a trusted advisor, right? We've got to get everybody in the defense industrial base thinking about this now, planning for this now. As you mentioned, if you're not in POAM reporting a score, that's where you need to be. So hopefully we can help out a little bit today with some clarification. I can tell you firsthand that SMBs are looking at the control set and the requirements and going, is the cost of implementation going to exceed my revenue from these DoD subcontracts, which is a very legitimate concern, right? So initially, early implementation involved, I would say, almost exclusively virtual cloud-based full enclave design, which ended up being super, super costly. And I knew a lot of contractors that ran for the hills. So if you want to flip to the next slide, Kevin, we can start talking about how to make this work for you, the people that are on the webinar right now, because I think that this is really, really important. And it's okay to think a little bit outside of the box. So we're going to talk through initial thoughts. The very first place to start is scoping. And the reason that we do this, there are some questions up on the screen that you can see, and I'll go into detail. The reason that we do this is that we can't design a perimeter if we don't have an understanding of all of these criteria, namely identifying the files that are considered CUI. And I can tell you firsthand through this process, that has been a major gray area with a lot of lively debates. CUI can be created by the DoD. It can also be created in delivery of a product for the DoD by a contractor or a subcontractor. Up to now, contractors and subs that I've been working with have not had a clear label in place for CUI for legacy or even current contracts in most cases. So there's a lot of question marks there. In terms of defining what is CUI that you've been asked to protect, I typically advise contractors to go back to their contracting officer for clarification. But I will say for this problem, help is on the way. So you can see in bold, right? Title 48 CFR. Part of the proposed ruling will require, and this is under Title 48, will require contracts to specify whether the contractor needs to have a CMMC level 1 or a CMMC level 2 in order to fulfill the contract. It will also require the contracting officer to verify that. And the way that they verify the CMMC level ahead of level 1 and level 2 certification going live sometime in 2025 is going to be with your SPRS score, your SPRS score. So the items that Kevin just covered absolutely will validate you. We're still self-attesting at this moment. We're still reporting a score based on that self-attestation. But when CMMC goes live, we'll have Title 48 that requires some sort of clarification and labeling in contracts. That will help. Ahead of that, some of the questions that we need to ask are, who accesses CUI at your business as part of their job? What percentage of the workload, the day-to-day workload, is dedicated to CMMC contract delivery? How is CUI accessed? And where is it stored? How is CUI received, created, shared, and delivered? There's a lot there. So in terms of that question, we want to understand file types, right? There's a lot of different functions of the business, from bidding on a project, estimating, receiving the award, to now production, developing the product, building the product, designing the product, ultimately delivering the product, and then billing for that work, right? So we need to understand what the line of business apps look like for the people at the business who are working on these contracts. I do in construction, manufacturing, engineering, I talk to some subcontractors where everything is cloud-based. And does it make it a little bit easier? Sure. To use SaaS solutions and keep everything in the cloud where the perimeter is more restricted. Others are using AutoCAD. They're working with large drawing files. We are having conversations around estimating database, accounting database, bill of materials, and if CUI is really included in any of those repositories, right? And in that scenario, we might even run into, say, in the example of a machine shop, legacy solutions that exist on-prem that have to be air-gapped because they're not up to date in terms of OS and patching. And there's a reason that we have to stay on those legacy versions to support our manufacturing line of business software. Another thing that we need to think about is printing required. Do we need large format plans printed out? Do people need to hold the drawing in their hand, or can we stay strictly digital? So these are all questions that we want to ask. And it all comes down to price. That's where we're going with these questions, and that's where we're going with designing the perimeter. But as we want to design and as we want to understand costs, these are the things that we need to scope for. Ultimately, the goal is securing the flow of CUI. So that means that we're drawing a gigantic circle around the CUI. Nothing can go in or come out unless it's going to somebody else who has done the same exercise and is eventually CMMC certified. So what we're going to do with that in mind is we're going to talk about a couple scenarios specifically. These may not be applicable to everybody on the call, or there may be parts that are applicable and others that feel like maybe they wouldn't be a good fit. Every single perimeter design is specific to the business, and that's the most important thing. We're not going to fit a square peg in a round hole, and if you try to do so, you may end up spending more than you need to be compliant. So in terms of models, and some examples here for the folks on the call. I am not going to spend too much time talking about full virtual enclave. We've seen some of these go live. We've seen some contractors go through DIBCAC assessment that have a full virtual enclave. And what I mean by that is everything is cloud-based. Everything is in GCC High and Azure Gov. We're talking virtualization, so there might be AVDs. We're talking virtual firewalls to protect the perimeter of that environment. Everything is enclosed. We're talking in a lot of cases SharePoint in that GCC High environment, Teams, so there's correspondence in that GCC High environment, Teams calling, et cetera, et cetera. When we talk about GCC High, and I know we're going to have some questions on this later, we're talking about a little bit of cost increase over standard Office 365 licensing, maybe at about 30% cost increase and annual upfront billing. That's not a good fit for a lot of SMBs, and maybe a subcontractor who has an influx in users. They might have seasonal staff where they have a larger number in the summer, and annual upfront isn't the best fit. Month-to-month billing is better. So all of that said, that's our full virtual enclave. I don't want to spend a ton of time on that today. I'm available after the call. Please feel free to reach out to me. You'll see my contact information and be able to ask questions if you would like. Kevin, you want to flip over to the next slide? Perfect. Thank you. So the next scenario we're going to talk about, and there's two different models here that I'm going to present based on this scenario. So we're talking about a smaller subcontractor. They are dealing with CMMC as a flow down from one of the primes, one of the big guys. They may be producing one part. They may be producing adhesives, or they may be staffing for a government contractor. Their part is a smaller part in the ginormous cog. In this scenario, what you guys are looking at, and again, this is one of two, and I'll tell you sort of what drove me to build this plan that you see in front of you for this theoretical contractor. This is a hybrid endpoint model. So in this scenario, what we're doing is we are serving CUI in a location you can see on the right side that I have it listed as files. That could be in the cloud. It could be in GCC High, in SharePoint. It could be in a product like ExoStar's managed M365. Now, to get to that cloud repository, and there are plenty of other solutions that are FedRAMP that meet the criteria for CMMC CUI cloud file storage. What we want to ensure is that in order to get to that repository, that's part of our enclave, that's where the files live. And keep in mind, in this case, they can be cloud-based files. So it's formats that might be Word, Excel, PowerPoint. We could be dealing with drawing files in this scenario, PDFs, et cetera, et cetera. In order to get to that file repository, I'm going to talk a lot about zero trust network access. Now, this for us in planning implementation for SMB has been a game changer. It's typical to think about accessing a central repository with a VPN. We've been doing that since God knows when. We've been doing that forever. What zero trust network access brings to the table is so much more. So where we would want to implement this is we have to protect a file repository. We have to ensure that any machine going to that file repository has certain things in place. So I know the text is a little bit small, but you can see where I have zero trust network access. That is the entry gate. And on the left-hand side, I'm showing you laptops. Now, these laptops are user dedicated. They could be located in a physical office location. They could be located at home. They could be a remote workforce, right? That's flying or traveling, or where they are depends on the day, right? And that's really what we're trying to solve for. So in order to access that file repository, we have these devices, call them laptops, and we have zero trust network access. Now, when they try to connect their zero trust full encrypt FITS 140-2 validated tunnel into the file repository, we're checking that they are authenticated. This is the tiny text you probably can't read. They're authenticated as a named user within a security group. They're allowed access. Now we're interrogating that device, right? Does the device itself have EDR? Does it have antivirus? Is it protected against malware? We're checking for remote patching. We're checking that those endpoints are up to date in terms of operating system. There are no existing vulnerabilities. We're checking for volume encryption. Those endpoints are in the scope for CMMC. They're in this perimeter that we've drawn. You can see the line in blue. That's our perimeter around it, right? So they need to meet all of the criteria for the 110 controls. If all these checks pass, they shall pass go, and the user on that device is allowed into the file repository. So we're drawing, it's a virtual perimeter around the laptops in scope, the ZTNA agent that is confirming the laptops meet the criteria, allowing access and establishing a full virtual tunnel up to the file repository. Now you'll see outside of the blue line, I've got some cloud-based controls. As I mentioned, these are all things that are required for these CMMC endpoints, we'll call them. We have SIM in the list. We have remote management that might control our patching, that might control our vulnerability scans. We have application allowed listing. That's our control to ensure that we're monitoring all the software that's running on those devices and it's pre-approved and that it's allowed. That protects us against supply chain attacks. We have vulnerability management. We have endpoint detection and response. We have DNS or URL filtering that's going to protect us from malicious sites as well. And then on the right-hand side, again, outside the perimeter, in this scenario, I have the contractor using federation through Entra. That may not be the case. There may be another product in place that is responsible for identity and access management. So the criteria that I just listed is on the right side of your screen. Again, this is a smaller contractor. This is potentially not everybody in the business needing to access CMMC throughout their day. some but not all users, right? And some of those users may be in the office, some of them may be hybrid. As long as they have their dedicated device and their zero trust network access, they are authorized to access the files, the pot of gold at the end of the rainbow. And they can do their work in the web browser, they can do the work on their dedicated laptop, and we can pull artifacts showing configurations. We've got auditing and alerting in place and all the good stuff that CMMC really cares about. Do you want to flip to the next one, Kevin? So this one is pretty similar, but there are a couple key differences. And this is one that we talk about all the time. Again, for manufacturing, those who have machines on a shop floor, those who have legacy line of business apps, whether they need to be air gapped or isolated within the physical network, we need to keep some of this on-premise stuff in scope for CMMC. And what that means is that the physical office location is going to be in scope. Now, another criteria that would require this sort of scenario is printing. If we need to print out large format drawings, if we have physical copies of CUI throughout the building, our network infrastructure has to be in scope because we're printing to either Ethernet or Wi-Fi printers. We also need to think in this scenario about physical premises security. So do we have video surveillance in place at the physical location? Do we have badged access? Are there areas that are specific to CMMC that are locked down that you have to badge into? Is the shop floor controlled by badged access? Do you have a visitor log? And our visitors accompanied when they come into these sensitive areas. So again, this is a similar sort of enclave where on the right-hand side, we're looking at a shared file repository. In this scenario, that could be on-prem. It could be a physical file server. In this scenario, it could also be a cloud file repository. Again, if you look over to the left from the files, you have zero trust network access. Now, that's critical in both these designs for all the reasons that I mentioned. We're still interrogating the machines, and you can see that we have laptops, we've got servers in the mix here. I'm sure there are some physical desktops in the mix. There are some heavy duty CAD machines, most likely. They're all going through the same set of integrity checks. Is the OS up to date? Do we have endpoint management? Do we have EDR? Are we volume encrypted, et cetera? So very similar scenario there. The main difference on this one being that we have the physical location and scope. And again, all of our CUI is protected by our physical premises controls. The endpoints themselves, again, have SIM, remote management, application allowed listing, et cetera, down the list in terms of cloud-based controls. And we have a method of authentication for the ZTNA product to say only named users that I know about that are authorized to access this data can get into the pot of gold, the file share on the right-hand side there. You can go ahead and flip. Excellent. So that's a lot. Again, you're going to get these slides and there's a lot of text. I try not to read through word for word. Please feel free to reach out if you have any questions, but that's kind of how we're thinking outside of the box in terms of helping SMBs implement something that makes sense. Of course, there are 110 controls. We talked about endpoint controls. It is advisable to have a provider in place to satisfy the incident response, 24/7 monitoring, auditing and alerting, and all of the controls that protect us as well. So you don't necessarily need to go it alone. There are experts out there who can assist with third-party cyber. And again, I'll get into third-party consulting for CMMC and building of the plan of action and milestones and the implementation. When we've decided on what our perimeter is going to look like, what's actually in scope, and where we draw the line, this is the most important piece in front of us: training, policy, and implementation. Our C3PAO assessors are going to love to see all of the artifacts. Policy library is utterly important because policy is going to relay to our assessor and relay to the organization and all the employees why we're doing what we're doing, why these controls are in place, what 800-171 criteria correlates to each one of these controls. So policy library is something that, in a parallel effort with building out the enclave, is equally as important. And when I say policy library, of course, that list can be pretty long and extensive. In my opinion, the absolute most important policy in the library is your acceptable use agreement. Your staff should have a full understanding of their responsibility in handling CUI, and not just CUI, other protected, other unclassified information that's also protected, like PII. And that's, again, part of the 800-171 control set, is training and educating your users. So policy library, acceptable use agreement, that summarizes everything in a nutshell. So your team doesn't have to read and be responsible for 20 different policies. It's all right there. They get that when they come on board, they sign off on it. Anytime there's an update, or at least annually, they'll read it again, review any changes, and sign off again. So our policy library, we've designed the perimeter, we've implemented the perimeter, and as things change through that implementation, your SPURS score is going to increase. So this is another thing that's important, right? You can upload your SPURS score as many times as you want. You implement one control, you get 1 point, you go in and update your SPURS score, because that's what the contracting officers are looking at today. And that is not going to change until the proposed rule goes live, and until we actually have certifications in hand where we can say, look, I have my cert, I passed audit. But yes, please update the SPURS score in the PIEE portal as frequently as you make changes. And that's a great way to show progress and instill some confidence in your program and your implementation. Want to go ahead and flip to the next one, Kevin? Lastly, so getting ready for audit. This is another big conversation, probably second most popular to how do I scope CUI and know what I'm responsible for in my environment. Network coverage is a registered provider organization. This is how we engaged with ExoStar, and this is honestly most of the conversations we're having around CMMC are organizations seeking certification who may go into the Cyber AV marketplace and find an RPO. An RPO has to have at least one registered provider on staff in order to be an RPO. Ideally, we'd be looking at somebody to assist with readiness assessments. Contractors should be looking at someone to assist with readiness assessments that is either an RP, or better yet, a CMMC certified professional, that's a CCP, to assist with building your plan of action and milestones. In most cases, we're talking a questionnaire-based approach. Come in, let's perform a gap assessment against the 110 controls. Let's build your system security plan. If you don't have one yet, let's build your plan of action and milestones. And that plan for the controls that aren't in place, there's definitely some consideration for each of these controls beyond just how do I turn it on, right? How costly is it for me to turn this on? How heavily is this weighted within the SPURS scoring system? If we have a limited budget and we're allowed to be in POAM, and we have controls that are not in place that are valued at 1 point, not heavily weighted at all, but it's going to blow the budget for 2024, that might be one that you can pause on a little bit and think about. If we have controls that are weighted at 5 points, multi-factor authentication is weighted at 5 points. If you have Office 365, it's not going to cost you anything to put multi-factor authentication in place. So that's a no-brainer. And that's really where an RPO or even somebody with the bandwidth of being an IT provider, knowing the solutions, knowing that maybe there is a setting in your existing firewall where you can enable IDS, IPS, right? And it's not going to cost you anything. So that's where it's important to really have a partner who knows their stuff, who can advise on this is what makes the most sense. This is the low hanging, low cost fruit that you can knock off right in the beginning to bump up your score versus these are the things that you really want to put some thought into. Maybe we push them out towards the end of 2024 Q4 because right now we have that little bit of wiggle room. And then when we start thinking about reaching the end of POAM and booking that C3 PAO level 2 assessment, right? How do you get ready for that? There's been, again, a lot of conversation around gathering artifacts, what the assessors are going to want to see in that scenario. And this is, again, just I want to pitch a value prop for an RPO, an RP, or a CCP to assist you in. This is exactly what we want in terms of evidence. We want a screenshot of this control showing the time and date stamp, and we want to upload it to fulfill the questionnaire over here. And that's a lot of work and it's a lot of planning. And the beauty of it is an RPO can be your partner for the entirety of the process. As I'm starting to hear about joint voluntary assessments, DIBCAC assessments, the MSPs and the partners are being called to the table because we want people who know the technical controls, who can speak to how they are implemented to satisfy the CMMC controls. Any assessor is going to be happy if the right folks with the right knowledge are seated at the table. So again, an RPO can be, RPO, a consultant can be so helpful in this scenario and really take the load off of you as an SMB who may or may not have a cyber person or a compliance specialist in house or the time to sit through that. Maybe you want to do your day job while you let the RPO handle it. So that's my pitch. Again, you'll get all my info at the end of the webinar. Happy to help, happy to advise, happy to think outside of the box. It's creative problem solving. And it's been a little bit of a puzzle, but I think there's a light at the end of the tunnel here as we get closer. So that's it.
Great. Thanks so much, Bridget. So everybody, we're going to head to the question and answer session part. So I'm going to keep Bridget on the line with us to go through that. I do have an exit poll, and as I mentioned, I'd appreciate it. I'd appreciate you filling this out. This lets us know kind of how we did today. Also, we'll ask your opinion on kind of what topics of interest you might have in further conversations as well. So I'm going to throw that up. So as I mentioned, these are the questions that we received before. So I'm going to go ahead and Bridget, I think number one's for you. So we're a two-person company with 2 computers, 1 Wi-Fi router. Where do we focus on CMMC?
So that's a good one. I will say that I've worked in this scenario a couple times, and I can offer 2 different approaches. In one scenario, it's a small enough company, and those 2 people were located sitting right next to each other in a garage-based office. So in that scenario, although it sounds expensive, it's almost easier just to consider the office as the CUI enclave, right? If it's a small office and there's only 2 people sitting there and someone comes to the door, they're going to be monitored as a visitor. You don't have to worry about them wandering around, and it can be low cost to put in all the other physical premises solutions that are required. I've also seen somebody address this scenario almost the same way that I've seen companies address classified data areas in some scenarios too, and almost treat them as an air gap. So that's an option. With two computers, can you treat those two computers, or maybe even just dedicate one as an isolated CMMC contract delivery resource? And do we have the ability, if we're receiving the files, to keep them restricted to that one computer, or maybe just the two? That's another option. But again, I think if it's just two people and they're in the same location with the Wi-Fi router, we could very easily just call it a location model. Depending on what the Wi-Fi router is built like, if it doesn't have a firewall or any sort of advanced configuration, it may make sense to put a firewall in there. But again, that's a low cost implementation just to secure that perimeter for the single office.
Great, thank you for that. I think we said I'm going to take number 2 here. So if you're in a Microsoft ecosystem, do you need to be in a GCC tenant if you're using an enclave approach for CUI? So the thing to keep in mind with Microsoft and their various environments, and I understand it gets confusing when you go to their website and they've got all the different options, is if in many cases CUI may also entail ITAR information. And that's really where the difference between the Microsoft environments may come into effect. Because if you also need to store, or if your CUI is also ITAR, then you most likely then do need to be in GCC. And the reason for that is in the GCC area, the support and operations teams that support those environments meet those ITAR requirements. So with that said, it doesn't, right, you don't have to be in a GCC tenant in the Microsoft ecosystem to satisfy the CMMC requirements, but you may for some other requirements that you may also have. So it depends, I guess is the best is the best answer I have there. Let's see. So number 3. So what is required of our computers that access CUI on a secure cloud? We need to create test reports, FAIRs, etc. Would applications like Excel and Word run in the cloud?
That one's really going to depend on what your cloud application is. Most hosted file repositories will allow you to use Excel and Word in the web browser.
Yep.
The key thing to think about in that scenario, does that platform allow you to restrict downloads of the CUI? And that whether the answer is yes or no, that's going to change the way we think about it. If we can completely restrict downloads, screenshots of CUI, or any exfil of this data out of the browser, then you could be okay just running, just housing your CUI there and allowing your users to access that from any location. The better answer for that, because there's always, there's always a risk, right? If a control is disabled, potentially something could get exfiltrated inadvertently. That's where I go back to my ZTNA concept. So taking it, down one layer, everything lives in the secure cloud. But in order to get to that, we might have ZTNA in place with full tunnel access, and the cloud might require a specific public IP to get into it. And by having ZTNA agent on your endpoint, you can ensure that you have the required public external IP that the SaaS-based file program is looking for. And again, with ZTNA now, we're validating that our computers have all the CMMC controls before they're allowed up to it. So if there is a download of files or if somebody needs to work locally again on those files, if it's something over and above Word and Excel, that we can bring that designated computer in scope to access the cloud data.
Great, thanks. So I think number 4 you answered in the discussion, Bridget, but probably makes sense to highlight this. And this is that scoping question, right? So, most of us who have looked at NIST 800-171 have seen, right? It's written that these are the things you need to do, but it's not particularly prescriptive in that you must do these things. So how do we define what is in scope and what is not?
Yeah, it comes back to the scoping conversation, right? And in terms of it being vague, I can sort of understand, there's got to be some nuance to it because we can't, we're not trying to endorse specific vendors or specific tools, and tech changes over time, right? So we want this set of controls, we want this framework to be timeless. Although I'm sure it could change. That's always a possibility. But yeah, we talked a lot about defining what was in scope and how the upcoming proposed rule will add some additional context to these contracts that we'll see over time. So that should be helpful.
Yeah. And I think kind of reiterate what you said as well, that to me, the best thing to help define that scope is basically follow the flow of the CUI. Understand, who gets it, where it's put, who has access to that, who processes it, where it's stored, et cetera. And that should give you a good definition of what's in scope and what's not. So number 5. So would like to know how we can achieve CMMC without moving to Azure GCC High or another very expensive platform.
Yeah, so I think that's where we think outside of the box and we design, models like the ones that I had shown. Um, to be honest with you, ExoStar's product can be managed Microsoft 365 can be a key component of either of the models that I showed. If we get to a point where we can say email is completely out of scope and we are receiving CUI from our contracting officer or our customer via a secure file share from our cloud CUI file platform, and we are sending it back via secure file share, right? We,
Yep.
we don't necessarily need to have email in scope. And I think that would be sort of the way that you back out of GCC High or a similar platform.
Yep. Great. So, ExoStar has a suite of products that can help in this journey, right? Bridget just talked about our managed Microsoft 365, which can be that enclave where you store, process, and transmit controlled unclassified information. Our Policy Pro application can help with that building of that policy library. That provides templates that you can then customize to fit your organization. It scores those once you've completed them, or takes the ones you have today and scores them, provides you some key indicators of keywords you might be missing, word counts, et cetera, that can help you improve those. Our certification assistant application allows you to walk through that NIST 800-171 assessment. It'll generate that SPURS score that you need as you mark off what you've implemented and what you've not implemented. Allows you to put in place those POAMs for those things you haven't closed off yet. And it really allows you to manage that overall CMMC program. And then obviously we've got great partners like Network Coverage that can help you with that CMMC assessment process, whether or not you want someone to come in and see how you're doing today to make sure your self-assessment is valid and on track, or even we have some other partners who are those C3POs who can help you through that certification process once that comes into play as well. And the nice thing about Certification Assistant and our partners like Network Coverage, you can actually invite them into Certification Assistant to work with you to help you, work through those POAMs, generate areas where you may need some help or some ideas in areas that you need to close off. Additionally, we have free trials of both Certification Assistant and Policy Pro. If you want to find other partners like network coverage that you want to reach out, those are on our website as well. So with that, let me go. Let us kind of finish up the questions here. So Bridget, number 6 here. So my main question revolves around our proprietary software system. So this is something they've built in-house. Will the information within this system be considered CUI as it details how we produce our end products? The process is their own, not government property, but it is derived in part by their drawing and specifications documents.
I'm going to err on the side of caution with my response and say yes. As a contractor, you can create CUI in delivery of the final product. So I'm going to err on the side of caution and say yes. Again, this will be clarified in the very near future in your contract language, but I would go with yes.
Okay. So I'll take number 7 since it's about ExoStar. So if all information is held within ExoStar, does that mean I'm compliant? So ExoStar has a number of solutions. And some of you may have received questionnaires from ExoStar applications, but sent to you by primes that you work with, asking about your compliance and whether or not you are. We have our managed Microsoft 365, etc. So all of those, especially our managed Microsoft 365, just using that itself doesn't make you compliant. It's, we have a shared responsibility matrix. It satisfies 85 of those 110 controls, but there are still things you'll have to do, right? It's still your system security plan. You'll still have to cover those 25 of those 110 controls that aren't covered by the application, and explain really, kind of how you train and implement these things, how you train your staff on handling CUI and things like that. So, there's no, like, if I just buy this product, I become CMMC compliant. There is some other work you'll have to do around that. So number 8, what's the best way for a manufacturer with CNC machines, which make parts for a CU item, for that to work? The machine has CUI or derives CUI, does it not? And we get this question a lot. What do we do about those machines on the floor, Bridget?
Yeah, I would consider that a specialized asset. So by that definition, we're talking manufacturing equipment that doesn't necessarily house CUI. Perhaps it's a pass-through a print of a specific part or a cog in the machine, right?
Yep.
By definition, a specialized asset is in scope, but does not have to be assessed against the 110 controls. In that scenario, though, and I touched on this a little bit, I'd really consider that for a full physical location enclave model, just to ensure that the shop floor where those devices live, is protected, and you don't have visitors just walking free through that environment.
Great. And so number 9, we get this question a lot, but I'm going to ask it of you anyway, Bridget. So how much should I budget for CMMC?
Oh man, that's a fun one. To be honest with you, I don't want to throw out numbers.
Yep.
I will say again, it just comes back to the scoping conversation. How many people need access to the CUI enclave? That's going to determine how many licenses for that enclave, how many licenses for a zero trust agent, how many licenses for all the tools that are running on that set number of machines. For smaller shops, we're doing quoting today for, I want to say 10 is our minimum, 10 users, right? So it can work and it can be affordable. And I'm not talking hundreds of thousands. I'm talking, a much smaller amount to suit the much smaller environment. And the number of licenses and the amount of monitoring that needs to happen for that environment. If that was helpful, I hope it was.
No
Very
problem. I
vague,
know it's a
but
tough question, and like I said, we get it all the time, but
yeah.
it was submitted, so I will ask it. So number 10 here, hopefully what you got from the front end of this is CMMC level 2. It's going to be a requirement in 2025. We don't know a specific date. I wish we did, but we don't. But please get ready. Please be prepared. And I just want to thank everybody for joining us today. Bridget, thanks so much for your time today. Really enjoyed the conversation. And hopefully we can do this again sometime.
Excellent. Thanks for having me, Kevin. Thanks everybody
Great.
who joined.
Thanks all.
Take
Have a
care.
great day.